We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Hey, welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Subscribe and follow on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, where you get exclusive videos. Links to all the social media sites at bookedonrock.com. The latest blog on the website, vote for your favorite Cure album. Just had Martin Popoff on the show. He's got a brand new book out on The Cure. Wild Mood Swings, Disintegrating the Cure album by album. That's out now, and you can hear that interview in episode 141. And that leads us to this episode. We were going to run a regular interview. The guest had to reschedule, so we're going to do that next weekend. So I figured now's a good time to maybe go over some books that are good summer reading, summer rock and roll reading. If you have your vacation coming up, or even if you've already had your vacation, you got some time off on the weekends, head down to the beach, bring a book with you. Got some good recommendations, so let's get to it. Here are some rock and roll reads for you this summer.
What book is that you're reading?
My favorite book.
Do you like it?
Top priority of the summer.
It's existential, yet it's so accessible.
It's gonna be a good summer.
Who doesn't love the Beatles, right? Most people have a favorite Beatles song. In fact, most people grew up having a favorite Beatle. Charles F. Rosenay put out a brand new book called The Book of Top 10 Beatles Lists. 64 celebrities and Beatles associates revealing their top 10 favorite Beatles songs, albums, themes, and memories. Rosenay is well known to Beatles fans for over 4 decades of promoting conventions, festivals, and events. Since 1983, he's hosted the Magical Mystery Tour to London and Liverpool during Beatle Week, an event which brings travelers on the ultimate fan experience. For almost 20 years, he was the publisher and editor of the world-famous Beatles magazine Good Day Sunshine. After years of contacting celebrities, rock stars, actors, athletes, authors, and notables connected to the Beatles' history, Charles has put together this book for pop culture enthusiasts, music lovers, and fans of the greatest rock and roll band in history, the Beatles. That book is out now, and we had Charles on the show for episode 128.
The bigger picture, I always say the stars aligned when the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, but the stars aligned before that because it was meant to be. Pete Best was a great drummer, a great personality, a great guy, but he wasn't a Fab Four. He wasn't the mesh for John, Paul, and George. And you know, whether he sees it or not, it's the truth. Would they have gone as far as they did with Pete or not? I mean, that's a whole book. That's a whole speculation that we can talk about forever. I think they would have, but would they have been as happy? Would they have been as creative? You know, they loved Ringo. They loved Ringo more than Pete. You know, why does somebody love a friend more and want to be with a friend more than another friend? Yeah, they were mates with and buddies with Pete, you know, longer than Ringo, but there was something that clicked. And it proved, I mean, you look at the success. Look at the fact that we're talking about a band, 60 years later.
They did okay.
They did pretty decent.
What's better than Summertime and Van Halen? Undoubtedly one of the most influential rock and roll bands America has ever seen, and my personal favorite band of all time. In Van Halen, every album, every song, author Morgan Brown takes readers through the band's classic albums, charting their ascent from Sunset Strip amateurs to chart-topping arena rockers and beyond. He explores the components of their music and its inspirations, as well as introducing us to the musicians behind the songs, including the late Edward Van Halen, the one-of-a-kind frontman David Lee Roth, and Sammy Hagar, who revitalized the band when he took the reins. This book is perfect for new fans and longtime fans. Morgan was on episode 129 of Booked on Rock.
For me, although 1984 has so many great high points, I'd go back to the debut of the two. I think it's a more even, the quality's more even across the album, and I think sonically it's a bit better too. I think that Sunset Sound recording is great. Obviously the 5150 allowed Eddie so much more creative control, which is excellent for him, but I think they made some compromises because of that. You get Alex starting to have to use a scaled down kit and like electric drums to physically fit into the room, which it's kind of the sound at the time, but it doesn't sound so good to my ears now.
Van Halen, every album, every song is out now. Also out this summer is To Live Is to Die, The Life and Death of Metallica's Cliff Burton, the updated edition. To coincide with the 40th anniversary of Metallica's debut album, Kill 'Em All, Joel McIver has put out a revised and updated edition of To Live Is to Die, originally published in 2009. It adds a new chapter that looks at Cliff's legacy from a fresh perspective and includes commentary from current Metallica bassist Robert Trujillo and Aquaman star Jason Momoa, as well as an eyewitness account of the opening of the Cliff Burton Museum in Sweden in 2022. Testament bassist Steve DiGiorgio also adds his memories of meeting Cliff as a teen and then watching he and his band Metallica take off. Joel was on episode 128 of the podcast to talk about the life and career of the late great Cliff Burton.
He had become a bass player for the ages by this point, and yet he was in this thrash metal world, which blows my mind because it's not traditionally the home of virtuoso bass players, the ones we just mentioned aside. Puppets, I mean, to me, it's not just Metallica's best record, and really that's a generational question anyway. You know, you ask people under 30 what their favorite record Metallica is, and it probably won't be Puppets. You ask people, you know, of all generations now, you know, where they stand on Metallica, you'll get a different answer each time, quite rightly. But I do think that in terms of musical sophistication, that's where they peaked. Although, and at the same time, those songs are catchy as hell as well. You don't forget any of them. There's no escape on that record, right? There's no slightly dodgy song that they really didn't need to record. Those 8 songs, they're all excellent, you know, beautifully put together, and memorable.
Tool, Every Album, Every Song by Matt Carper. Matt was on episode 131 of the podcast. His book, all about Tool, one of the most unique bands in rock and metal history. Their music extremely complex and intelligent, while their insistence on privacy makes them an enigma to many. Matt documents all of this Los Angeles band's studio releases, from the raw and unapologetic 1991 demo tape to their 2019 epic Fear Inoculum. The stories behind every song, including the pivotal tracks Sober, Anima, Schism, Lateralis, and Rosetta Stone. Here's Matt from episode 131 of Booked on Rock.
I specifically remember Schism came on the first time I'd heard of this band Tool, and straight away, you know, just the name Tool, I thought that's a bit of a strange name for a band. And when it leads in with that bass riff, I mean, I was like, whoa, this is not, you know, this isn't a rap metal song. This isn't going to be the sort of thing we're used to hearing. And yeah, it just came in with that you know, that it made you sit up and take notice, I guess. I called it a legendary and otherworldly bass riff, and it just came in so different to what you was hearing at the time. I read that an analysis of the track also found that the meter of the song altered 47 different times. I mean, I'm not going to say I'm the most understanding in terms of the terms of, you know, used in song structures and different things. So even for this book, I had to really sort of delve into like the reasoning behind them and what sort of everything that went into the song, I guess. And it's quite ironic that, you know, one of the lead lyrics is "I know the pieces fit," because this really was a song that was concocted meticulously. I can imagine why it took so long to be put together. And yeah, it's just absolutely, that time I do remember it was unlike anything I'd ever heard again. And it was the reason why I did end up going to the shops and buying Lateralis to see what else they was capable of.
Author Sean Kelly has put out a brand new book called Don't Call It Hair Metal, Art in the Excess of 80s Rock. The 1980s, it was the era of excess. Bigger is better. A little just ain't enough. A time when the musical and cultural ideas of rebellion and freedom of the great rock and roll of the 50s, 60s, and 70s were taken to dizzying heights of neon excess. But time hasn't always been kind to the artists and bands of that gold and platinum era. The music often overlooked and ignored by critics, with the focus more on what the bands looked like and less on the songs they wrote and recorded. In Don't Call It Hair Metal, Art in the Excess of 80s Rock, Sean Kelly sets out to give these artists the respect they deserve. Sean stopped by for a visit for episode 132 of Booked on Rock. We covered the book, plus I asked him about Motley Crue and how they've replaced Mick Mars with guitarist John Five.
Listen, man, John Five is a remarkable musician, an absolutely incredible musician. I've got nothing but respect for him. but I also have no interest in a Motley Crue without Mick Mars.
Yeah.
And you know what? Even with the Karabi stuff, I actually love that Karabi record. I love it.
A lot of people
I love
like
John.
it. Yep.
It's a beautiful record. Should they have called it Motley Crue? I don't know. Because honest to God, Vince Neil, he's not the most technically gifted vocalist in the world. We know that. But the sound, and even Nicky back in the day, I don't know if he played everything on Too Fast for Love, but at Shout at the Devil, if you listen to the isolated bass tracks, we're not talking about a virtuoso at work here. Like, I'm listening. But together, the slop with the musicianship of Lee and Mars, the vision, and really Nicky Sixx, it's not about being a bass player, it's about being a visionary and seeing it through, and a lyricist and a songwriter, right? Like, I mean, those are his gifts.
Yeah.
And being a great bass player doesn't really matter in that context. You got Mick Mars, he's covering all the bases. You're good, I'm just not that interested. Who knows? Maybe they'll come up there in the studio with Bob Rock right now. Maybe they'll come up with something mind-blowing. And I hope they do, because the world needs more mind-blowing rock. But
there you go.
But at that time, it was those four personalities that made that happen. And I don't think it could have been anybody else.
Another phenomenal book to read this summer, especially if you're a Bruce Springsteen fan. Deliver Me From Nowhere, The Making of Bruce Springsteen's Nebraska by Warren Zanes. Fascinating story behind the making of Bruce's most surprising album, Nebraska, from 1982. Bruce considers this his best album, and we find out why from Warren, who spoke to Bruce Springsteen himself for the book, along with the many people involved with the making of the album. Here's Warren from episode 133. Bruce, he gives you a great description of what it was like recording the songs. This is chapter 11. He uses a TEAC 144 four-track recorder. Is that how you, or do you?
That's a TEAC. Yeah.
It looks kind of like what I'm recording my podcast. I was like a little, mini mixer.
I went and bought one on eBay. I found a broken one, and when I do book events, I bring it with me just because it's good to make contact with the material history and to see this thing. It
was ahead of its time at that point, right?
Ahead of its time, and now it looks like just this artifact of deep funkiness, and it's cool for people to see it. When we did the CBS Sunday Morning piece, I brought it out there, and it was beautiful. Bruce kind of put his hands on it, put both his hands, just like feel the things, like yeah. But it's recording on a cassette that you could buy. At the time, you could go buy them at CVS, and little kids would use them to tape their voices and play it back. The difference with the TEAC 144 was that it's 4-track recording. And so that was the revolution. It had been there for a couple years, been out on the market for a couple of years. But to put it really simply, it was the first consumer multi-track machine. Now multi-track recording is a mundane thing. It's on everybody's laptop, if you choose to do it. But then it was like, whoa, multi-track recording. And pretty soon you see that shift where people are starting to take it home. And in that respect, Springsteen's move was very prophetic of what was coming.
Author David Jacks was on the podcast for episode 134 to talk about his book, Peter Asher, A Life in Music, another must-read for this summer. It covers the life and career of English guitarist, singer, manager, and record producer Peter Asher, who was one half of the 60s pop duo Peter and Gordon before going on to a successful career as a manager and record producer. He's worked with James Taylor, Linda Ronstadt, Bonnie Raitt, Steely Dan's Donald Fagen, Diana Ross, Cher, Neil Diamond, Randy Newman, Kenny Loggins, Morrissey, Ed Sheeran, and Steve Martin. David spoke with Peter himself for the book, along with over 100 artists, friends, and colleagues. Here's David from episode 134. I want to go back to the first album that James recorded, which was under Apple Records. There's a familiar song title on that album, but the song itself is different from the one that most know, and that's Carolina in My Mind. The version that's included on James Taylor's Best Of from 1976, very different. The story behind that new recording is in your book. Warner Brothers asked Peter if James would re-record that song and Something in the Way She Moves from the Apple Records album. Can you talk about why Warner Brothers wanted those two new recordings? Why did they end up being recorded differently?
Yes. Well, if you recall, in the late 70s, early 80s, for a while, Apple was in, there were a lot of lawsuits going on between the Beatles, between Apple and Capitol. I mean, it was like, just lawyer heaven for a while. And so those tapes, those sessions were kind of in this limbo where you couldn't just license them, which, would have been the easy thing to do. And so because they weren't available and Warner Brothers wanted those two songs on that greatest hits album, they needed to re-record them. And Peter was always, and even James Taylor told me that though that first album was a little overproduced, Peter was so enamored of James and the talent and the songs that he wanted to make them stand out from the folk world. So there's some string quartet on it. They're fuller production. I mean, even Carolina in My Mind, the first time I heard it on the radio, it's a great production. But by the time James Taylor became a hit with Fire and Rain and those Warner Brothers records, he was doing things much more low key and acoustic. And so since they had been doing Carolina in My Mind in that way for a few years now live, it was like, well, let's just do it in that way, not try to recreate that original version. So it's much more, like I said, acoustic-y and a little slower. So that's the way those two songs were done for the greatest hits.
Another fascinating summer read, Magic, the David Payton Story. David Payton is the singer, songwriter, and bass player with the group Pilot, and he's written the worldwide hits Magic, January, and Just a Smile. He was a member of the Alan Parsons Project for 10 years, did session work with the Pretenders, Paul McCartney, Kate Bush, Chris de Burgh, Chris Ray, and Jimmy Page. He also spent 3 years touring the world and recording as a bassist for Elton John. He even performed with Elton at 1985's Live Aid. David was on the show to talk about some of those stories. Episode number 136. I asked people about that song. I've been bringing up the fact that I'll be interviewing you, and I said, he wrote that song, oh, 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 it's magic. And it's an immediate response. Like they'll say, oh, God, I remember the first time I heard that. That reminds me of, or, I play that for my kids and they love it. You write about composing the 4 bars on piano. And then after that, the challenge was getting the right verse. Can you share with us how that verse came to you?
Yeah, well, as you say, I had the chorus. I had this little chorus that just went, oh, ho, ho, it's magic, never believe it's not so. It's only 4 bars. And I used to sit at my piano with a cassette recorder above the piano. And every time I wrote something, even something that was just 4 bars, I would press record and record that little 4-bar piece, then move on to something else. So that little piece was on my cassette player, waiting for a verse to come along. I had to get up early one morning as the sun was rising, and I accidentally woke my wife up as I was getting up, and she said to me, wow, look, I've never been awake to see the daybreak. And suddenly I heard it as a melody, and my little magic chorus came into my head, and I thought, this little line, I've never been awake to see the daybreak. Well, I modified it a little bit, never been awake, never seen a daybreak. But I knew there and then I had a full song. Most songs, you only need a verse and a chorus. Sometimes you'll add a middle eight, but Magic didn't need the middle eight. And that was it. Yeah, I usually get it from something that somebody says to me, and just a little line, or even, I wrote a song called Love Is, which was based on the little notepad that you used to get, and it said love is in the corner. Little things like that. It's always something somebody says, and you just think, oh, that sounds like it could be a song.
Author Joe Matera was on episode 137 to talk about his book, Backstage Pass, The Grit and the Glamour. Here's a book that's a definite must-read for this summer. Joe has interviewed artists from all over the world, covering the full spectrum of genres. He takes the reader backstage and beyond to get behind the facade of the rock stars he's met. He's got stories on Nickelback, Lemmy from Motorhead, The Shadows guitarist Hank Marvin, Ray Manzarek, Brian May, George Martin, Gene Simmons, and John Mayer. Here's Joe from episode 137 talking about John Mayer.
John came out to Australia. When he came out, no one knew who he was. I didn't even know who he was. I just got this press release saying, this singer-songwriter from America has got this album and, he's coming out to do a showcase. So I was invited to the showcase, and there was only about 20 people at this really sort of dingy sort of inner city sort of bar. And most of them who were there were more interested in having their free alcohol and, just sort of checking out who this guy guitar player is. So John's on stage. He's playing all these tunes, no one's sort of really taking much note. And, I can sense that, this is a guy who's really extremely, talented on the guitar and has got some great songs. And he got to the last song and he could see that he wasn't winning, many people over. So he decided to throw in a cover of Stevie Ray Vaughan's Lenny, right? And which is, he just played it, and all of a sudden, everybody just swarmed in front. And they go, wow. And he just did this amazing cover, one of the best covers I've ever sort of heard from an artist. And he won everybody over. And I knew straight down, I thought, well, this guy's going to be going places. So what happened then was 6 months later, he broke. He was becoming a really big star in Australia. So he came out again, and I got to sort of interview him again. He remembered everything in detail, where we were, what we talked about. I thought, wow, this guy is pretty switched on. He remembers me. He must have done hundreds of interviews since then. So we got on really well, and he opened up to me, and he just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
One of my favorite bands is Living Colour, and there's a brand new book out for you to read this summer called Living Colour's Time's Up. It's part of the 33 1/3 series. Kimberly Mack is the author. She was here for episode 138 of the podcast. This book is an in-depth exploration of the 1990 Living Colour album, Time's Up, recorded in the aftermath of the critical and commercial success of the band's debut record, Vivid. She interviewed members of Living Colour and others involved in the making of Time's Up.
I think I would describe it as an album that, if you listen to it right now in 2023, it sounds fresh. I mean, every time I listen to it, it doesn't feel dated to me. It doesn't sound old. It sounds like it could have been made this year, in part because of the fluidity between the different categories of music. I think artists do that more now than what was happening in the late 80s or early 90s. So I would say this is a record that's going to sound kind of familiar in some ways to you. And sonically, it's not going to be like, oh, this is old or whatever. Also, I would say it's just a fantastic record in terms of the level of musicianship, the level of Corey's vocals, and just the songs themselves. I think the songcraft on all of them are amazing. It's just, I think it's like a consistently strong record. I don't think there's a weak track on that record. And then I would say, from a lyrical standpoint, for better or for worse, probably for worse, so much of it, again, could have been written right now. History is a lie that they teach you in school, a fraudulent view called the golden rule. I mean, when I hear those lyrics, I think about all of the kind of, panics around, in K through 12 around critical race theory and banning books and all this stuff. It's like, I think about that when I hear that song, Time's Up. Yeah, Corey was sounding an alarm, but now the environment is worse. Like, we didn't listen to the alarm, information overload. It's kind of predicting the chaos of the internet and social media. This is the life. You could also think about it in terms of social media and, what young people are kind of dealing with in terms of, there have been studies about young girls in particular and how detrimental the internet has been for young teenage girls on their self-esteem, on their feelings about their bodies and their physical attractiveness. It's just been terrible. So yeah, I think this is a record where I would say, for somebody right now, for a young somebody right now, there's so many things on there that you can listen to and get something out of, even though it was recorded more than 30 years ago.
Mudhoney guitarist Steve Turner teamed up with author Adam Tepedalin to release a book that is one of the best of the summer, Mud Ride, A Messy Trip Through the Grunge Explosion. If you're a fan of 90s rock, man, this is a great book to read. Chronicles the birth and evolution of the Seattle grunge scene, from amateur skate parks and underground hardcore clubs to a worldwide phenomenon, told by one of its founding fathers and the lead guitarist of legendary alternative rock band Mudhoney. Steve and Adam appeared in episode 139 of Booked on Rock, and Steve revealed, as he does in the book, that he was offered the job with Nirvana back in 1990. You mentioned in the book you were asked to join Nirvana as a second guitarist. You didn't think that was a good idea?
No.
Why you felt they were better as just one guitarist?
Yeah.
Would have.
I mean, they weren't anything yet. You know, remember this was like right when Dave Grohl joined, and right after they kicked Dan out. So, and Dan was my roommate at the time too. So I was like, I can't join a band that just kicked out Dan. But I legitimately just thought they were a great three-piece. And so my advice was like, don't get a second guitar player. You guys are great as a three-piece. Like that's a rare beast. A really good, powerful three-piece is a rare beast. And I didn't even think of it at the time. It didn't matter or anything. And years later, I thought about it like, well, what if I had said yes? I wouldn't have lasted more than a few weeks, I don't think, because there's just a lot of chaos involved with those people. Yeah. And as much as I love them, Chris is awesome. I've known Chris forever, but I wasn't the guy to be in that band. And that's pretty obvious, it wouldn't have worked out. And they got Pat Smear, and he was the dude.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what did you think? How did they sound when they added Pat Smear?
It was great, but they'd had a second guitar player earlier, which is terrible. It was just muddied up the sound. But Pat Smear was the dude. He was the right guy for the job. He's a great guitar player and could somehow maneuver his way through those very volatile personalities.
One book I want to mention, it came out in November of 2022, but we just recently had the author on, and this is a definite summertime read. Secret Stars, The Greatest Underdogs of the Rock and Roll Era. It's by Matt Berenson. Discover some amazing musicians that flew under the radar. Some you may have heard of, some you may not have. They may not have received as much radio play, if any at all, as their more famous counterparts, but their music and stories are just as incredible. And personally, the one band that I now love because of this book is the band Love, with the legendary late great singer and songwriter Arthur Lee.
Love was a rock band the way you think of a rock band. They put out albums, they played shows, they have had lyrics to their songs. They were not a house band for anyone else. They were their own thing, LA band. And basically, once I found out about them, I heard their album Forever Changes. Their third album was sort of the album they were famous for, and that some people considered among the greatest albums of all time. And
Library of Congress has it on their list, right? Library of Congress.
There we go. It turns out, if you look at almost any list from the 20th century of the greatest rock albums of all time, it'll be there. Rolling Stone's 500 greatest albums of all time from I think it was the year 2003, the first one they did. Forever Changes is 150 on the list. It's way up there. And in the UK, it's much bigger than it is here. Any list of the greatest albums of all time in any UK music magazine will include Love's Forever Changes. So they are bigger there and better known in the UK than they are here. But they never had any. They had one top 40 hit here, minor hit called, two, but really not huge hits at all. One was a cover of a Burt Bacharach song called My Little Red Book, which is fantastic. Their version of it is so much better than his. And then a song called 7 and 7 Is, which I was actually surprised was their biggest hit here, because it's very punk. It sounds like a really aggro early punk song, because it was 1966. They were way ahead of the curve. And I just fell in love with all of it. Their first three albums, which are the three that with the original lineup. And then really he recorded several great albums as Love after that, but not as great as those three. The first song Jimi Hendrix ever played guitar on was written by Arthur Lee. and it was recorded by a female artist before love existed, even when Arthur was a teenager. He wrote a song when he was 19. He and Arthur met each other then and remained friends for the rest of Jimmy's life. And I tracked that friendship through the whole chapter, as you know. So Arthur Lee starts an integrated rock band, and wouldn't you know, so does Jimi Hendrix. So Jimi Hendrix and Sly and the Family Stone were the first famous integrated rock bands, or in the case of Sly and the Family Stone, R&B, soul. But, you know, Jimi Hendrix learned a lot from Arthur Lee. That's all I can tell you. Love's guitar player, Johnny Eccles, used to play the guitar behind his head.
Yeah.
So Jimi Hendrix was around. Before the Jimi Hendrix Experience, there was Love.
And I mentioned earlier Martin Popoff's book, Wild Mood Swings, Disintegrating the Cure, album by album. That is definitely one to add to your list for this summer. It's presented in a Q&A format, and it takes a critical analysis of the Cure's 13 studio albums and some books that will be coming out very soon that you definitely should check out. One is Brothers and Sisters, the Allman Brothers Band, and the inside story of the album that defined the 70s. Author Alan Paul will be on the podcast. I've got that interview set up for this week, so should get it out by the end of the week. It's due out July 25th. Due out August 15th through Backbeat Books, The Jive 95, an oral history of America's greatest underground rock radio station, KSAN in San Francisco. An oral history of America's greatest underground rock radio station, KSAN San Francisco. It's an oral history of America's first hippie underground FM station. Hank Rosenfield due on the podcast very soon to talk about that book. Looking forward to that. Another author we're looking forward to having on is Nina Antonia. Nina wrote the cult Bible of all things Johnny Thunders with her book Johnny Thunders in Cold Blood back in 1987, the definitive portrait of the condemned man of rock and roll, from the baptism of fire and tragedy that was the New York Dolls, through the junky punk years of the Heartbreakers to his sudden and mysterious death in 1991. There's a brand new edition out now, a new closing chapter, new photos, and more. We're going to have Nina on the show very soon. Also looking forward to that one. That's a look at some of the summer rock and roll books that are out now or coming out soon. You can go to bookedonrock.com as well to get a link to all the new releases. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen. We're on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, Google Podcast, YouTube, iHeart, Spreaker, TuneIn, and more. That's it for now. I'm Eric Senich. Thanks for listening to Booked on Rock.
That's it. It's in the books.